an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, look at that. It is Wednesday, May the 10th, 2023. Today would have been my dad's 85th birthday. And I know what he would have been doing today. Getting his chair all set up, his stats book out. He'd have been sitting there, made sure that the Coors was cool. All set for Game 4 tonight. He was the epitome of the Leaf fan. I mean, my dad never missed a game, and I swear to God, when I was cleaning out his rec room, he had his chair, right? And beside him on the table, he had a notebook, and the notes went back years, and it listed all of the Leaf players, their goals for, goals against, their plus minus, the year they got drafted, all this. I mean, he wrote it all out by hand, right? And having been a guy who was in the business of counting trees, listen to our podcast called Canadian Forestry Can Save the World, by the way, if you want the full story. He was a guy who was involved with forest inventory, and his department actually took the aerial photographs of all of the forest in Ontario, and then they created the maps based on that. And in the day, they did it all by hand. So he learned from the map makers, and his handwriting was impeccable because it was like script, right? He didn't really have a cursive handwriting, and he didn't print. It was more like script. And so anyway, I went through this notebook, and I wish I had hung on to it, because tonight I just wonder what would be tops of his list. He'd be all over he had his own analytics, shall we say. But but to the other end of it, we'd be somewhere in the house, and there'd be this loud scream come out of the basement, out of his room, and you knew it was either a good goal or a shitty play, one or the other. And one year this was in the late 70s, so this is in the middle of Harold Ballard. And you think, things are frustrating now. At least the team is entertaining and the ownership supports the team. In those days, it was just awful. And so it got to a point where my dad was so aggravated, I bought him a foam brick so he could throw it at the television. And he made good use of it. So today we remember him. So happy birthday, Dad. And everybody kind of hanging on what's going on with the Leafs tonight. And there will be I don't know if it's just sort of a slight exhale if they win. It'll be a complete deflation if they lose. I don't know. I'm not sure that the psyche is ready for one or the other. I said earlier, it's like the dog chasing the car. They won round one as if the dog chased the car, and now the question was, now what do we do? And clearly they weren't really clear on what they do. So all that, we'll talk about it tomorrow, no doubt. Okay, a couple of things we want to get to, and it was interesting yesterday. We had a chance to talk to David Coletto at Abacus about a number of things, and he was talking about the issues that are facing the federal government, federal politics, and he appreciates why the Conservatives might be banging away on foreign interference, but it was his sense, clearly, that that's not what's resonating with the public, just generally. That we are really looking at issues that deeply affect what happens literally at and on the kitchen table. And to be tone deaf politically about that is to be, kind of politically in peril. So it was interesting this morning to see in the inbox from our friend John Wright at Maru Public Opinion a rather deep dive into the actual condition and the household outlook here in Canada, across the country. John's a regular voice on the Ledge, and you heard our anniversary show yesterday. If you haven't listened, pop in and have a listen to. It was 5 years ago yesterday. We started on the Ledge, and it kicked off all of this podcast adventure. So today, happy to welcome in to Now and Next. How are you?
I'm good. I just wanted to say that was a great tribute off the top of
the podcast to your dad, and what a great day it would have been to be around the table at the lake, right?
Yep.
And do that. In 13 days, my dad would have been 100 years old.
Wow.
And his big thing was baseball. And he used to tell me of stories when he was growing up in Toronto. They used to go down to the old Toronto Star building, which was which was downtown. But they used to have a great big diamond painted on the side of the Toronto Star building. And they used to have somebody who would stand on a platform and move the players around the bases so they could stand on the sidewalk and look up and see it. But those were the days when you had 5 editions of the Star. And I was a Star carrier at one point. After the telly folded, I did that, but then I did the Star. And of course, you could get 5 different updates. They'd update the front page and stuff like that. So you'd have a Bulldog edition, which would be at one end, and you had a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star, 5-star. I mean, you had all this sort of stuff. What an incredible era where you're right, taking down all of these notes. And that then to my next point, I have a friend who's just retiring, who is being quite an adventurer, but actually got into forestry soil analysis. And for the last decade, he's used satellites where they call him in and say, we want to know what kind of trees are growing here and the kind of trees that could grow here. And from a satellite with particular filters, they can go right down to the leaf, literally to the leaf. And they can look at the leaf and analyze it in a second to determine the kind of acidity there is in the soil and whether things would grow or not or stuff like that. So what an incredible period of time where your dad kept all these notes when a flick of a finger would have it now on a PowerPoint or something somewhere.
Yeah.
And secondly, even just their whole lives, which was so manual. And now we're into chat bots that we can ask them any question. But what a great day it would have been at the lake. And what a great day I always remember my dad. He always was very modest, but it was always the weekend they let off fireworks because it was the Queen's birthday. So it was always, as little kids, we thought it was just for my dad, and it was always a great memory. So,
Well, in our house, it was Dad's birthday and Mother's Day.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it always happened. So it was a great family celebration. So that was the fun part. My dad taught me actually how to use a slide rule. Now, don't ask me to do it now, but I went to school and I could use a slide rule in grade 2. So it was, he was that guy.
You should have been an engineer or something because that's ancient stuff.
Yeah. Well, he you talk about that, the satellite technology now to essentially do the job that they were doing for aerial photographs, and then, looking through the stereoscope, and they could see how the photographs were taken, and they could get elevation and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, the math that went on, and he was a guy that went to the ranger school, and they didn't have a program for forestry when he was of age, 17 years old. So he went up to Dorset, took the program at the ranger school, and he became a scaler. And the scaler, they still have a scaler in the bush. That scaler goes out and measures the quality and the quantity of the timber that's cut in the bush, so in the lumber camps. He was 17 years old when he got his certification. To this day, we're pretty sure he's still registered as the youngest scaler in Ontario's history. So it's kind of cool. When he passed away, he had a scaler stick. It was like a yardstick with a hook on the end of it.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And when Dad passed away, he had a couple of them, so we gave them to the kids, and Aaron and Dave have them hanging smartly in their offices at home and tell the stories to their kids about their grandfather being the youngest scaler in Ontario. So,
when we came across recently a tray that was given by Roundtree Chocolates in York to my grandparents, which would be the great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents of my kids now. It was for their wedding in 1910.
Wow.
And that, it was by a complete fluke. It fell into our hands from a distant relative who said, here, you're collecting stuff. You can have it. Yeah. It got my brother on a bit of a journey to find out where we came from. He's a retired PhD, professor, so he knows how to do this. In the last month, not using Ancestry.com, but by going through and looking at actual records, we've taken, you ready for this? Taken our family all the way back from what we knew was 1806 in England to 1385 in Leicester, which would have been which would have known then that when Richard III was brought naked into Leicester after the Battle of Bosworth and buried in that parking lot church, they would have witnessed that. So it's a humbling experience to go back, what is now, I say to my kids, 17 generations, but all because of the computers and what we do today. It's just remarkable.
1,000 years.
And it's incredible. Yeah, I didn't, the first thing I asked was, does anybody owe anything? And then I asked, is anybody royalty? And I got back, no one, both can. Right. So I'm sticking to this job for a while more.
Indeed. Well, let's dive into these numbers, because I think there's a positive and there's a negative, literally and figuratively, in all of this. And when you looked at the trend, I guess, in terms of people's attitudes towards their own financial circumstance, the economic circumstances generally, it looks like we're seeming to come out of the dark a little bit. That is to say, you're seeing a bit of an improvement over the last few months. Whether it's my own financial situation is improving, the economy's improving, but we're still more people thinking that it's negative than positive.
I think the metaphor that came to mind was something my old friend Daryl Bricker once said, and there was a song, I'm sure you would know the artist, and it was, I'm so far down I can't even see the curb. You kind of get beyond, you look your eyes up, and once you get to the curb, you think you're doing pretty well, when in fact you're still not standing. I've been studying this tracking of the economy since 1990, so it goes back a fair stretch. The one with Maru goes back, the index goes back 2 years, the other tracking goes back 3. So let me get to the point. 6 in 10 people in this country believe that we're headed in the wrong direction, that the economy is not going to improve over the next 60 days, either locally or nationally. You've got about 4 in 10 people who are struggling to make ends meet, and that's more acute among young people as opposed to older people. And there's a whole series of other, elements that go into this index, of which there are 22 that I look at, 16 that are used for the index, and of that 16, 12 of them are up. So I think we're at the curb because we've gone the lowest that we went in all the tracking last month. And this time, as I said in the analysis, the question is whether this is a bubble or a burst. Don't know which one it is because it's the first time it's gone up, but it's certainly an orchestra as opposed to a one-note response to what we're seeing. But overall, I mean, the country is in a deep funk. But it's better than it was, and we're back to where we were last July. That's a better way of putting it. It's not, we're not certainly out of, lifting up and saying woo-hoo. But interestingly enough, and to your point about Mr. Poilievre and the Conservatives, to link it, all of the areas that the Trudeau Liberals need to win, absolutely need to win, all of those provinces and regions are up. The ones that are not are all the ones they don't need. Saskatchewan and Alberta, no one cares about if you're a Liberal. So even Quebec is up 40 to 40% saying that, things are great, we're on the move. And you would say, well, that's still below the national average of 60, and that's still a minority. In order to get a majority government in this country, you need 37%. They're sitting at about 31. If they can even make 32 or 33, they still deny the Conservatives, which seems to continually pitch to their base. Have meals with fringe candidates from the far right of Germany who are, now doing preemptive ads on the Prime Minister, which are all about him taking an expensive vacation in this, to Jamaica, that are addressing a whole series of other issues about, anti-vax and freedom. It's just not on it's on the agenda for their people who have always stuck with them and always want to be them. But for those people who are in that band in the Ontario region called the 905 and in many other parts of the country, all it does is paint their wagon as being people that are not acceptable to vote for. And when you get a lift like this in areas of the country saying, it may be really bad in our mindset, but it's better because the government is doing the right things, that helps the Trudeau Liberals. It's a juxtaposition. So, That kind of sums it up. 6 in 10, wrong path. We're in the wrong direction, blah, blah, blah. Roughly 40% saying, you know what, we're not too far off. You need 37 for a majority government, and you're getting a bounce in the places you need the votes. That sums it up.
When you talk about the, 4 in 10, really stretching it to make ends meet, how does that relate to previous tracking?
Well, you would then have to look, to this particular question, and it would be over the last 3 years. And I can say that the worst time that we had for that was in July of 2022, when 40%, so I'd say almost a year ago, 40% said it's getting hard to make ends meet. I actually ask it in a way that I can determine who are the real people who are suffering and how much are they suffering. So I would say right now, 15% of the country just cannot make ends meet completely.
Right.
Absolutely not. Back in July of last year, 19%. So that's 1 in 5 Canadians. That's a lot of people.
Yes.
I mean, people think, oh, that's only, 19%. Well, 19% of 33 million adults is, 6.5 million people. So there's, and I know that there are certain people who not only can't make ends meet, but show up at food banks and, are reliant on government programs. When you have 34% of people in the country having trouble to make ends meet, and you have 27% saying that if it weren't for government programs, they wouldn't be able to get by on anything. That's a hardship regularly, but right now it's more than it normally would be.
Well, you throw in the number that our friends at the Daily Bread Food Bank have come up with. There's 270,000 individual visits to the food bank in Toronto on a monthly basis. Mm-hmm. That is 4 times what it was prior to the pandemic. And you're now talking about 33% of those clients at the food bank have full-time jobs. So I imagine that the people that you're tracking who are saying they're having a hard time, paying the bills, it's not that they're unemployed or it's not that they're underemployed. They've probably got full-time jobs. So there's where the real, to me, the economic indicator there is, to your point, it's going to be very difficult to really pull that group up out of where they are right now.
Well, yeah, and there's a few things that go with that, Dave, because I do live in that big city, and I live midtown, and I've grown up with a lot of what's happened, and I see a few things that have happened. Number one is we can't dismiss the fact that the federal government has effectively invited, and rightly so, lots of refugees from the Ukraine and from other places to come to Canada. But it's one thing to invite them and to have maybe a sponsor to do it. It's another thing to plop them into the middle of nowhere, that they are then having to see how to get a job and what to do in the city. And not have living accommodations, and they've got to feed their families. I mean, that's a reality. We have way more people now than we did before, but people who have been dropped into a city that doesn't have all the infrastructure, and arguably is absolutely outside of Vancouver, the most expensive city to be in. So, I mean, I have a 30-year-old son who's married, who's been renting for the last many years, and thank God they got into an apartment well before everything went up, but he would not be able to live here. It's just too expensive. They'd have to live in Newmarket outside of the city or go somewhere else. So number one, I don't know how you get affordable housing here. All the Mayoralty candidates is talking about it. I don't know how you do that. Nothing's attainable. You got to have $1.5 million to even, to put a roof over your head, all that sort of stuff. The second thing, though, is that when we talk about full-time jobs, I'm not sure exactly how much wages are being paid to some of those full-time jobs. But what I do know is that there are people who are getting livable wages that would be acceptable in other parts of the country, like Calgary and Edmonton, where some of my nephews actually have headed, and they're going to own their own house and do things. But in downtown Toronto, at an $18 an hour minimum wage, to work in a place that might be full-time, you can't exist on that whatsoever. So with higher inflation, which is now coming down, but with, inflation the way it's been, variable mortgages the way they have been, and interest rates going up on credit cards, you in particular see this incredible dichotomy among those people who are 18 to 34. On the one hand, they think it's the best of times because they are free to make their decisions. And like I see it in the numbers, I'm not just talking off the top of my head. There's a portion of them that see everything as good. But there's also a very, very significant group of struggling young people. And they can't make ends meet. They can't put a down payment on a house. They can't live adequately unless they're shacked up with their parents or with a group of other people. And this is not an existence for them. Like, they got to find some other thing to do. So there's a series of conditions that are not just COVID, legacy related. This is the fact that people are living in really expensive cities that have squeezed them because of inflation. And for whatever circumstance, there might be, the economy is now still producing lots of full-time jobs and many part-time jobs. But when you say that, what are they actually living on? Mm-hmm. And a full-time job can be $25,000 a year or $30,000. And that's just not enough to live on. So you got to go to a food bank or find other means to deal with this stuff. It's just, it's incredible.
When you look at the numbers, and I suspect that it's not necessarily something specific in the numbers that you can point to, but at what point does this reflect our expectation or our own perception of leadership? Because this in and of itself demands a call to action by whether it's political leaders or business leaders, whatever it may be, to come up with the vision and solution that is going to raise this boat entirely. And on the one hand, I can see where you talked about the government services that are there that have helped people make ends meet. And so there's an expectation there. But on the other side of it is, again, back to your point about the mayoralty candidates, all talking about we're going to create more affordable housing. Okay, take it beyond the bumper sticker label. How do we do that? I worry that when we see this kind of number and the trend of the number, yes, it's on its way up, but I'm looking at your graph and it's pretty dismal when you look at the last year. Mm-hmm. The idea is, to me, it's almost a self-perpetuating malaise that feeds on itself, that unless we have something that's going to break this system or really install some level of expectation around leadership that is attainable and realistic, this is going to drag us down in not just in the coming 60 days. How do you turn that cycle around?
Well, we know from polling over the last 35 years that it does turn itself around. There will be sunnier days. Things will be better. For a group of people in our society, it will not be. They just can't get up onto the rung. We see, those slogans which come to mind with previous administrations. We give a hand up, not a handout. The minimum wage or minimum guaranteed living wage has been attempted, but it's never been followed through. Even though it's got good results, there are certain programs which cater to certain parts of society. But we do know that approximately 60% of the public will turn and say things are good, which leaves the others behind. And that's always been the case. I think you're touching on something else, though, and that is that there's a built-in cynicism. I listened to a commentator this morning saying that no matter how bad things or good things get, we're a pessimistic and cynical society in Canada. Well, yeah, that's probably true. I've often said that, Missouri is tagged with the line, they're called the show me state. In other words, this is really, it's interesting you say that, but show me the proof in this. And that's a product really in this country of politicians amplified today in the Toronto mayoralty race who, just as you say, are all talking about affordable and attainable housing, but don't put on the table not only realistic plans, the talking points, even for a new candidate that got into the race this morning of some prominence, it's all talking points, but there's no plan. And secondly is just the evidence. Does it ever happen? So there's an underlying cynicism in this country because oftentimes those things that are promised don't come to fruition. Politicians nowadays particularly with the incumbent liberal leader of this country, and I'm not casting aspersions or bias on anything, but if the ethics commissioner says you broke the rules and it continues to be pointed out and you do nothing about it except to say, oh, well, they got it wrong, like they interpreted it wrong, clearly I'm right, it just provokes a bunch of cynicism, not only on that front, but on many others. So I look at this and say, we could be all out of the the dismal negativity of this within the next year. And I think the Liberals are going to hang on until, things start to look really much better. But it doesn't take away from the cynicism that's built in, that's naturally kind of Canadian, that sort of says, I've heard this all before. I see it, but I don't see it in my paycheck, and I don't see it, in my lifestyle. And I continually hear all the things that I hear about with not being able to get a house and stuff like that. And especially for young people. Let me leave with that report that you read actually had a key thing that I said at the end. In 2015, the Trudeau government won in the final 10 days of the campaign when they rallied those who were young. Mm-hmm. And it was primarily, I remember the full page ad in the newspapers across the country that had Mr. Trudeau standing looking towards the camera off site, and behind him a massive amount of people in a room that he was speaking to. And what it said was, I am here to give you hope. That was it. And it rallied the greatest number of young people to come out and vote for the party, which then propelled them into electoral majority. Like that's what happened. Harper was gone. I don't see that hope right now. I don't see young people with, frankly, the amount of hope that the party could be injecting back into it, because I know of so many young people who want to own a home and they can't, and they need to get out of this cycle of debt now, and they need help, and they have no one representing them except a bunch of hot air. And that's unfortunately, the Gen Zs not so much, but the Gen Xs for sure. This is how they feel nowadays, abandoned, and they need to get that kind of not just moral support, but they need action, because otherwise you end up with a group of people in our society who are carrying forward a sense of hopelessness, and they need hope. More, just to go with the reality, but they need that sense that somebody's listening and doing something for them.
Let me throw another factor into all of that. So, folks who are in their late 20s, early 30s, which is kind of the wheelhouse you're talking about, have gone through two catastrophic economic turns. I mean, the '08 collapse, and then we saw the pandemic. And I hear it all the time where they look at how corporations treated their parents in the financial crisis in 2008-09, that there was no loyalty, that there was no, all that kind of stuff just kind of went by the wayside. And now we come back to the pandemic, and all the way through it, we kept saying, this is bad, but we've got opportunity here to learn and build back better. We've lost that. There was the hope, right? That was the hope. That was the label of hope. We're going to build back better. And we have failed to address that. We have turned our attention elsewhere, shorter term, and I think that opportunity may have passed us by.
Well, man, what a bucket you've opened up there for discussion. I think a lot of it has to do with corporate reputation. I mean, on the one hand, you really can't have prices on groceries going through the roof, and on the other hand, having the board of directors for Gale and Weston giving a great big raise. You can't, I mean, what credibility do you have in that? I remember my first job in the private sector was in government relations at Manufacturers Life back in 1981. I was actually the first government relations coordinator. They didn't even know what that was about. And I remember reflecting upon what the Manufacturers Life people had done for their own employees during that time. They had opened a cafeteria which gave lunches for free. It then became a definable benefit, unfortunately, and they had to do some price adjustments in the 1980s. But then I remembered my parents taking us to the old Sears outlet downtown on Jarvis Street. And there on the 5th floor was a place where you could go and get a hot meal for next to nothing. Now, that was a product of the soup kitchen days, which then, folded over into the other ones. into the days that followed, and the public could go in and get that. I remember going in, getting macaroni and cheese, a great big plate of for like 5 cents, and it was a big outing for little kids to go and do that. But it spoke to a different sense of social commitment. Fast forward to today, and corporations, if you're in the publicly traded, are judged by each quarter's financial circumstance. And so they've had to cut back on open-ended benefits, unless you're a federal or provincial or municipal unionized worker. It's all defined benefit, or it's not at all. We've just had legislation which has been passed by the government of Canada and approved, where in fact now if you're a pensioner, you go to the front of the line instead of the creditor that's owed down the street, for the services that have been provided when you go bankrupt. I guess we're coming back to some sort of normalcy, but there is a sense in this society that you get paid and that's enough. Our corporate responsibility is a corporate good that if we give you something, you should be grateful for it. It's now seen as an attract and retain strategy, but it's still not enough for a lot of these people. So the cynicism about corporate reputation, and I can tell you that, in all the barometers that look at corporate trust, they've all fallen massively, which has now led to a different kind of metric called corporate respect, which encompasses a whole series of other factors, but includes trust. The amount of respect we have for our businesses and how they look after people has dropped immensely, and the tests are actually during these times. That's it. I mean,
absolutely.
These are the times when corporate reputation and the ability to attract and retain employees is based on the actions of the leadership and of those corporations, because it's not just to instill that kind of loyalty among people that we're with you thick and thin, but it's also to say to a marketplace which is short on people and you need people to come and work for you, saying, you know what, they walk the talk. They actually care about people, and that's where I want to be. It doesn't take much, but boy, oh boy, when it leaves you, it can leave you for good.
Yep.
So it's something which has to be taken into account.
Well, exactly. Once you've damaged that respect factor, that trust factor, it is incredibly difficult to rehabilitate that, particularly, again, among those who are directly affected. And that brings me back to that demographic where they saw their families directly affected financially. They might have lost homes or businesses, whatever it might have been. And there could have been all kinds of really good effort to mitigate that, but it doesn't matter. It happened to them. I mean, you will know just the circles you and I will walk in and move in, particularly in media, how much that the trust and respect for media has changed since you and I first met, 20 odd years ago. I mean, it's incredible how that's just fallen right off the cliff.
But there's also the other point, and I like to go to the housing analogy because it really, or not the analogy, but the truth of it. I have 4 kids ranging in age from 21 to 31. And right now, the Gen Zs, the 2 of them that are still in that category at one end, I mean, Value Village is a place they love. They can go and get all kinds of things for cheap. That generation seems to think that way because they were around during the 08-09 crash, and they saw their parents pull our horns in and stuff like that. It's the next level, that 30, 31 years, who feel robbed and cheated. They can't have a house. They don't, I mean, they can't, unless the people who normally at this age would have been retiring and going and selling their homes and giving some kind of benefit to those, saying, look, I've got $30,000 I can give to you out of this. I'll give it to you on your birthday as a gift so you don't have to pay tax on it. And you can use that as a down payment. $30,000 gets you nothing. It doesn't even in some cases pay, a third to the half of the credit card debt, which is racked up because they have to cover student loans that they've never been able to pay off. So the whole aspect of them being caught as a generation in between, and the fact that I hopefully will be living much longer than my predecessors. Like I've known people with, prostate cancer and breast cancer and others who would have 20 years ago was a death sentence, who today, I know of somebody who actually had pancreatic cancer who's coming back. Like, who's gone from having dropped from 180 pounds to 120 is now back to 170. They've gone through the chemo stuff. Like, it's remarkable. But the fact is, we're going to live longer, and what that does is let us stay in our houses longer and not have that that cascade of wealth into the next generation, and they're caught in between. So, going back to where we began, there's a group of people in this country, and they tend to be in that age group, who really don't have hope and who don't hear a lot from people that they're being looked after. But when they go to get a job, are still stuck without that kind of long-term support and at minimum wage and working longer hours that they can't get the next rung up. So it's, when you say struggling to make ends meet, and it's, roughly 39% of the country and 15% proper, you look at the numbers within that, a lot of young people, and it was not like this, I think, 20, 30 years ago, when the different demographic dynamic and different circumstances existed.
Completely. And I mean, it'll be our grandkids and their kids who will write the history and really the full picture commentary on how all of this is played out. But I think your work at Maru, it really is the there's no lagging indicator there. I mean, that's happening right now. This is a very specific, in the moment perception of how I feel about the economy. And again, perception being reality for so many people, that's a hard thing to shift. So it'll be curious to see how the next index reflects any of that glimmer of hope and where the horizon might be.
And to wrap it up, the one thing I always, as I said, I've been doing this for a long time. In fact, I was the first one with the colleagues at Angus Reid where we had an agreement with a newspaper chain, Southern News. We put out the first publicly released polls. Like, we actually were the first to do this. And I think public opinion, and I mean, everybody takes it for granted nowadays. We have to remember that 30 odd years ago, we just didn't have access to it. Like, we didn't. The politicians would say, this is what the people think. And Southern News actually stood up and said, no, we're going to find out what people really think. And we're going to tell the politicians that this is how they think. Public opinion is an artifact. And we have a number of companies now, like David Coletta at Abacus, who I respect an awful lot, and Daryl Bricker at Ipsos and other places, where they're in it for the truth as opposed to some kind of hucksterism. And so we have an artifact of public opinion that we didn't have 35 years ago, where you can actually reflect upon this, very rightly so, years later, and say, this is what they were thinking at the time. And to put a fine point on it, my 21-year-old son was at Dalhousie University this year doing a statistics course that he had to do for his business management, who called me very excitedly one day and said, Dad, we were looking at one of your polls from the 1990s today. And it's in a textbook. But so is Dick Assman, and how many people would have voted for him, by the way, and David Letterman, and all of that in those days. But that's where public opinion can play a role, where we put things in context. And I think when you reflect on where we are today, people are going to see why young people may feel the way they do in the debate about long-term care and other things when it comes to baby boomers' time for support, and they don't have what they needed at that time.
John Wright, always good to get your insights and, to your point, the context on all this stuff. Thanks for doing this.
Always a pleasure, Dave. Take care.
John Wright is the executive VP at Maru Public Opinion. Also, we failed to point out a distinguished fellow at Queen's University. That's
Here.
Pretty fancy. Do you get to wear robes or something when you go to the university?
It's funny. My daughter just graduated after 4 years at Queen's. I had always wanted to go to Queen's. In fact, I applied. I was first accepted there, but I injured my knee that summer while working at Ontario Place as a summer student, and I had to have my my meniscus repaired, which in those days was more like World War I surgery on the battlefield compared to today. So I wasn't able to go. So fast forward, number one, I have the right to wear whatever Queen's has because I paid for my daughter. We paid for our daughter's tuition and residence there, which I'm so thrilled at her graduation. But finally, it's come full circle that after all of those years in high school of wanting to go to Queen's and not being able to do it that summer, I'm so grateful they granted me this opportunity as a senior fellow. So guess what? I have the Queen's leather jacket. Can you believe that? After all these years. So there you go. Full circle.
Yeah. Badge of honor. John, thank you. By the way, if you want to do me a favor, you can follow us on the social media. If you got a thought on any of this stuff, at Dave Trafford finds me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're also active, very active on LinkedIn as well. And if you enjoyed this show, and maybe there's somebody in your life who is expressing some of the attitudes and perceptions that John's described, share the show with them. Pass it along. Let them put an ear on it. And if you like, give us a comment, because it always helps us, and rate the show at Apple, because then it helps other people find the show through their podcast apps. All right, that'll do it for May the 10th. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.